All right, so I'm gonna try to get through this in the next 20 minutes, maybe 15. I'm gonna stand because I've been riding a bike a lot and I feel like my kneecaps are broken. This is a really important talk, and I think that part of what goes into all of this is that I think for some people, at least in my conversations, it's a bit almost exhausting to continuously be evaluating the systems that we're in, right? Obviously, it's not easy to dismantle a system that's as historical as what we're talking about. And so a lot of this really just requires constant evaluation. So I'm going to start off by just talking about two personal anecdotes and then move on to some legislation as it specifically pertains to Latinos and this whole issue of the animal rights movement. I don't even really remember. I think it's been like 12 years or something that I've been vegetarian to vegan and all this fun stuff. And when I first started, I was volunteering at a farm sanctuary in the LA area. And it was there that I first encountered my first racist experience within the vegan movement, right? And so it was really problematic for me. I'll tell you a little bit about what happened. I decided I was going to volunteer at this farm for the whole summer, and I was so excited. When you get there, you realize you're pretty much shoveling poo the whole time, but even that is magical because you get to be around the animals and, you know, shovel poo next to this magical 2,000-pound cow. So I was very excited to go every day and clean. And then toward the end, you know, actually every day when I was done, I would go and just sit out there, and there's nothing out there, so it's very peaceful, and the animals and everything. So then I was hanging out one time, and the shelter manager approached me, and he was like, "Hey, how do you like being here?" And I was like, "I love it. This is great. I wish I could live here." I'm sure all of us have felt that way at times. And then he's like, "Yeah, well, I was doing an investigation. I don't know if you want to hear about it. You know, these things can get pretty rough." And I was like, "Of course, tell me everything." So he starts telling me about how he went to a farm. I guess it was kind of a shady operation. There was some negative stuff going on with the cows, a lot of animal abuse happening, and he happened to have these like glasses that had a camera right in the middle, so he was doing his Magnum PI. I don't know if anyone knows that reference. I'm aging myself here, but MacGyver, that's still kind of old. But anyway, he's looking at all this, he's getting it all on tape. Okay, so I was like, oh my goodness, it's horrible. You know, the cows, they were beating the cows and all these things. So we're relating on that issue. And then he drops the next statement, which is, and sorry if anybody has issues with profanity, I don't, so. He said, well, yeah, this situation, you know, there's a bunch of fucking Mexicans there, and all they're doing is just, they're all illegal, and so they can come in here and they think that they can do whatever they want, and they can abuse the cows the same way they do in Mexico. And so, you know, they don't know that I can just go up in there and call immigration. I can call ICE and just get rid of them, right? So I was like, okay, all the breathing techniques that I've learned over time, I completely forgot. I was like, what the fuck, what did you just say? And so part of, you know, some of an issue, if you want to call it that I've had is that sometimes people, for some reason, this has changed as I've gotten older, but they confuse me with something that is not Latina, so they feel like they can speak to me in ways that it's okay to talk to me that way because they think I'm not Latina, so I'm not going to get pissed or whatever. So we had a discussion after that, right? And, you know, it was interesting because I actually got involved with the farm animal stuff after I was involved with domestic animal rescue. And so that was actually the first place where I really got engaged in this. So that brings me to my second anecdotal experience, which is that being involved in domestic animal rescue was where my mind was boggled at the extreme racism that existed within that aspect of the movement. I had several experiences where I had a friend actually contact me from Peru who was dealing with a dog that was living in like an auto body shop, and the dog was being sexually violated by the people that were in the body shop, right? Obviously, not a cool situation, problematic. So she was asking me, can you help me get this dog either somewhere else in Peru, or can you guys bring it to the US, figure something out? So I was relatively kind of new to the whole madness of Facebook rescue and all of these things. I don't know if any of you have experience with it. I recommend you stay away. But I posted this thing, and it gets shared to other people. And the comments that started were, "Oh, her name is Linda Alvarez, so she must be some Mexican woman who's just trying to make money off of this animal," right? Because we had posted, we're trying to gather funds, go to GoFundMe page, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to help us bring this dog over here, at least get it medical attention in Peru. So, okay, so she must be. And then the comments continued. I've seen women like this. They stand by the freeways with their 70 kids. And what they try to do is try to get you to feel sorry for the kids so that you'll give them money, but then they have their nails and their iPhones, and so they're on welfare, but they try to get money from other ways. And so she's just trying to do the same thing with this. So again, I wanted to, since I was not able to see these people, my anger was directed at my poor little screen here. But these were some of the things that were just extremely blatant. When I live in a unique area of the San Fernando Valley, right? We have some issues in the area. It's not the quote safest, whatever you want to call it. And so I come across a lot of domestic animals that need help, right? So dogs, whatever. And so I'm constantly contacting women in the animal rights, in the domestic animal rights movement for help. And so the first thing they'll ask me is, are these people Hispanic, right? It's the first question. I don't know what the race of the people that have the animal that needs help has to do with anything, but there's a need to process that first before they can take on the animal. It's some salvation complex, I don't know what. The other place where it became very problematic was dealing with men in the Latino community and neutering their dogs, right? The comments that were constant, well, these men are machista, right? And the machista ideology is actually something that we technically can be applied across the board, but for the most part is applied to Latino men. And the kind of racist comments that ensued based on these practices, or people not wanting to necessarily fix their dogs or whatever, just went beyond what I thought anybody could ever really come up with. And I even had an animal rescuer approach me and say, well, since you're Latina, by this point, they realized that I was Latina. Since you're Latina, maybe you can help us reach the Latino people. What we want to do is make a rap video, and then we think that through this rap, we'll be able to really, you will understand what we're trying to say. I was like, oh, because I didn't know I came up to you like, oh, rapping. In my conception, I've been talking to you this whole time, but apparently I only speak rap. So it became really where I started to view, get a clear picture of what's happening. And then, it was after that I went to the farm, and I thought I could find some wonderful place with the farm, but it ended up being just as bad. And that's where I realized that racism and privilege is prevalent in the animal rights movement. When you start doing research or looking up the demographics of the animal rights movement, you will realize that all studies that have done this, I'm sure you guys already know this, the movement is composed of white, middle class, middle to upper class, educated women who are liberal, right, who fall under this umbrella of liberal. And so a lot of the times it's easier, or what I have found was that it's easier to blame someone, to scapegoat an entire population than to deal with systemic issues. And that's why I'm saying things like this require constant evaluation. And when you have been existing in a system that doesn't necessitate you to evaluate anything because you exist in a system of privilege, then fundamentally to think about the factors that might influence why a person has their dog tied to a tree, or why the dog can't come inside and have a twin bed next to your bed, or whatever it is, requires some analysis that's going to start to have you check yourself and that becomes very uncomfortable, right? For a lot of us, that's what we have to do because we live in this system. But for people who are used to experiencing privilege, it's very uncomfortable to have to do that, right? And so it becomes an issue. So in talking about, those are anecdotal examples. Maybe some of you have also experienced this as well. But when we get to the bigger picture of the animal rights movement, as Liz explained, this is a white-dominated movement. We start to see some of the more systemic attributes of it. And so I wanted to briefly talk about horse tripping. You guys all, know what horse tripping is? Yes, when the charreadas. So in Mexican culture, right, and some other, granted that's one of the things where we're not all Mexican. I happen to be Costa Rican, but I've had people ask me if I speak Mexican, which is not a language, but that's okay. So in Mexican culture there are charreadas, right? And Alex can hook me up right here with some knowledge on charreadas. And so basically horse tripping involves literally what it means. You're roping the legs of the horse and pulling them under so that they fall over, right? And so we can, obviously process how this is problematic and how why we would think, or animal rights activists would think, that it was hurtful to the animals. The problem where we see like the systemic attributes of this come in, and I'm using this example because it was extremely blatant, was that animal rights movement moved to ban horse tripping from the 90s all the way through just recently, right, the late 2000s. And so it was, and there's current legislation again you're right, I just saw that, to continue to enforce this further. These bans on horse tripping coincided precisely with anti-immigrant legislation that was taking place in these states where it was banned. So two of the biggest ones are California. At the same time that Prop 187, are you guys familiar with Prop 187? Yes? So it was a staunch anti-immigrant bill. It moved to literally remove a lot of the rights of Latinos and immigrants together in the state. And so at the time that Prop 187 was taking place, it was an extremely polarized time here in in California. And it was also a very opportune time to put in this horse tripping ban, right? Because what you could do essentially is say there's already a discourse of Latinos, immigrants, right? The terminology that is used is illegal aliens, right? It's not even a human thing, it's these illegal creatures, right? Who come in with their practices that are problematic. And horse tripping would be one of those problematic practices. And so what you can do then at a time like this that's highly politicized is to infiltrate, right, the political movement that's going on in terms of Prop 187 and removing rights of humans. Put in the horse tripping in that, because then it's just part of the same discourse, right? And so what ended up happening, this bill was actually initiated by Eric Mills, who was the director of Action for Animals, and I am going to call out, the organizations because I think that needs to happen. It was problematic in the sense that it crafted the culture of Latino practices as being a threat, as being fundamentally cruel and inhumane to the animals. It also continuously reinforced the fact that it was a Mexican sport, therefore it was un-American, right? The term American is already problematic because the Americas, it's not just this north piece of it. And so it also classified charros, right, the cowboys, as potential drug dealers, right? They're all Mexican mafia, and it's very scary to have to deal with these individuals. So it did in fact pass, right? And the horse tripping bill was passed right along with 187. And so you can begin to see some of the systemic racism that goes along with these animal welfare laws in essence. In Arizona, is anyone here from Arizona by any chance? Any Arizona peeps? Okay, well, Arizona is like the super most racist state in the United States, right? Arizona is responsible for SB 1070. I don't know if most of you are aware of that, but essentially also criminalizes immigrants, includes racial profiling into the law, all these horrible things related to SB 1070. But right around the same time, this is 2009, 2010, that they were trying to craft SB 1070 and that the whole discourse around this law was taking place, Arizona also included a horse tripping bill into the legislature, right? And the idea here is that you have these heavy politicized environments where you're polarizing communities, right? And you can capitalize off the racism of one and include the animal welfare element into that, right? So the bill was intentionally, again, crafted to portray the illegitimacy of charreadas, right, which are basically like rodeos. And the difference was that they explicitly made them different from a rodeo, right? The charreada was Mexican. The rodeo is all American, right? And so the legislator from the bill actually stated, I want to read you two quotes. She said, first, I want to make clear that this legislation will not interfere with legitimate rodeo activities where the calves and other horses and cows are not hurt, right? So I don't know if y'all know anything about the rodeo, but it's a little problematic. Calves, calf roping, right? It's pretty much the same thing as horse tripping, but apparently no one gets hurt in the rodeos, as opposed to the scary Mexican charreadas. Further, when she discussed this bill, she linked the events of horse tripping in the charreadas to other kinds of crime, specifically child abuse. So she goes on to say, I have to laugh. I know people who abuse animals also abuse children, and to me, in my mind, both are very strongly linked. I think that any form of animal abuse in the state of Arizona needs to be prohibited, and very strong penalties need to be attached so that they know that we're serious about this and that we will not stand for that. Our people and our animals are more important to us than anybody, right? So even in the discourse, it's very clear there's an us and there's a them. You're illegal, we're not. Charreadas are bad and scary and hurt animals, and eventually you're all going to be child abusers as well. And rodeos are just fun times to take the family and have a barbecue. Extreme double standard, right? And so neither of these bills made any reference to the all-American rodeo, American, right? It was extremely, which is also extremely problematic from an animal rights perspective, right? Rodeos are not cool. And so part of what this discourse does and what this whole narrative does is essentially to shape power dynamics around the idea of illegality. And so when we're talking about Latinos specifically, the notion of illegal becomes an issue because we are constantly referred to, regardless of documentation status. The idea is either you're Mexican, they're illegals, they're problematic, they come here to exploit all of our resources, take our jobs, and literally screw up our entire lives. So the power dynamic that is embedded in this discourse is the biggest problem. Essentially, it criminalizes Latinos, right? It criminalizes migrants specifically. It marginalizes immigrants in the U.S. And what it does essentially is reproduce the repercussions of the physical U.S. border into our daily lives, right? And so you have this idea that the illegality of Latinos, right, and of migrants is that they're crossing some apparent force field that divides the U.S. and Mexico, and that's what makes them fundamentally illegal, right? You're coming into our country illegally when you step from this piece of dirt to this piece of dirt. And so through that illegality, this discourse of illegality, what it does is literally put that same idea into the cultural practices and beliefs of Latinos in general. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but fundamentally, when you apply this illegality, you're applying it to the actions and the customs of a group of people, right? So now, whereas my illegality was related, or this idea of illegality is related to me crossing a border, this idea of illegality is related to me, to people tripping horses, to people tying their dogs in a backyard, to just the very essence of speaking Spanish in a place where you expect them to speak English, right? So that border necessarily is carried with them wherever they go, right? And it becomes problematic. So part of this mentality insists that migrants are unwilling, right, and incapable of actually becoming part of the national community, because, you know, there's no way they could ever be like the rest of us U.S. citizens. They intend to destroy American life, and they will not assimilate into American life, right? So you can easily, you know, if you have been involved in the animal rights movement, you can easily take this framework and look at and apply it to the animal rights movement. And I'm sure you have examples of how this is reproduced, right? And so one of the things, and I'll go through this quickly, is to think about this narrative in terms of what we see in social media. Is great because it allows us to have everything forever. And so this is in relation to Farm had posted a story about migrant workers in factory farms, right? We know that for workers, it's an extremely terrible situation. Slaughterhouses are the most exploitative places to work. We know that corporations intentionally recruit people from Latin America to come and work for them because they know that they can be easily exploited. And so the focus of the article became this dynamic, right, this discourse of illegality, this discourse of the other, because everybody, instead of really catching on to the fact that the article was talking about the abuses of how it's a systemic abuse of not just animals but also people, this whole system is completely fucked up, it turned into workers being the problem, right? I don't care about workers, I'm unsympathetic. I can care less about these savages who continue to murder for a paycheck. It makes me so angry. Everyone has a choice. Everyone does not necessarily have a choice, and our choices are very different, right? And so again, this clearly displays, and this is just a sample. Farm did attempt to reply and try to clarify some of what the article said, but by then it was just completely, there was no punto in trying to do that because it was all over the place, right? And then so, when you think about this, this essentially negates so many things, right? So many things that don't incorporate things like racism, classism, and all of these things within the animal rights movement context. I'm going to skip over a couple things, but fundamentally, one of the important things that I also want to mention is that this discourse of illegality functions to silence the other as well, right? And so fundamentally, when you have a situation where, because the opposite of illegality is legality, right? And so when you are a person who has that kind of power, so for example, if I go into a neighborhood and there's a dog that needs to be rescued, right? And so I'm going in and I'm saying, I'm coming as the savior to help this animal, this poor animal. The power dynamic is so intenser, and especially when you're talking about communities that are used to being marginalized and pushed into this illegality discourse, right? And so by literally taking the animal, you're exerting your power, but you're also silencing the other, because what you're saying is you're doing something wrong in our society, right? And for a lot of undocumented migrants, there is a very clear fear of deportation. There is a very clear fear of the law and these kinds of things. And so when you're dealing with these communities to enforce your legality as opposed to what you consider their illegality, it's extremely problematic, right? It's extremely problematic, something that we definitely need to think about and consider, because you are fundamentally silencing an entire group of people, right? Based on your power, your privilege, and your legality. And so very quickly, one of the things that just like blew my mind, and just every time I see things like this, I'm shocked. I don't know why, but I am, and I guess that's a good thing. I should continue to be shocked, is that when you see this dynamic taking place and this power dynamic happening, you don't want to see the groups that you really supporting it, right? But right after the horse tripping law, the Animal Liberation Front, which we all love, basically said, Arizona has led the way again in animal cruelty legislation. Woohoo, go Arizona, so awesome. You guys are so great because you supported this racist, privileged, classist insertion of a bill into an already racist, classist environment, which then further penalized migrants by essentially passing SB 1070, right? And then this one, Liz knows that. I was like, what the hell? I went a little Facebook rant about this one. Compassion Over Killing retweeted Joe Arpaio. Does everyone know who Joe Arpaio is? Yes. Serious, right? He is the king of racists, right? He's a Maricopa County, sheriff of Maricopa County. Not only just a complete racist, a complete sexist, he has fundamentally, he's being sued by the Department of State for his racist policies. He, prisoner abuse, all kinds of things, right? But Compassion Over Killing thought it would be awesome to retweet him because he supports the ban of gestation crates. So that's really awesome. Let's just give more play to a racist. So I was completely bothered by this. I wrote to them, but they ignored me. And then to just further, they give more play to Compassion Over Killing gives more play to Arpaio because he went and made the jail vegetarian, right? So they're like, oh my God, and he not only banned gestation crates, he's also vegetarian. This is awesome. This is not awesome, right? He didn't do this because he cares about veganism or vegetarianism. It saves money. Most likely, he did this to punish the prisoners because this is not all vegan prisoners where they were like, hell yeah, this is awesome. So to give them whatever the hell this crap is, right? Is a form of punishment, right? But for Compassion Over Killing, it was let's give props to the homie who hooked up an entire jail, right? Huh?
That's not compassion.
It's not compassion for anyone really. Plus, it's like some strange soy. I don't even know what it is. So, yeah, it's some. When you see the picture close up, it looks very disgusting. So. This becomes fundamentally an issue, and I think you guys get what I'm saying here, right? When the animal rights movement reproduces this, it reproduces their privilege, right? Their status, their legality, right? And continues in this discourse of making everything else fundamentally illegal. And so we see this with everything, right? Religious practices, cultural practices, all these things that other cultures do on a regular basis that are part of their culture now all of a sudden become very problematic for animal rights. But there's a context and there's a need to very carefully consider these things. And as a person of color, I myself have found myself challenging this. And I think it's important for all of us, but especially the people of color, to continue to challenge these dominant structures of power because we can very easily reproduce this, right? And so one of the things that I have been thinking about lately, and I don't know, this may piss some of you guys off, but I'm going to say it anyway. The idea of decolonizing your diet, right? So for us, people of color, we're going to decolonize our diet. It becomes very important. We can get behind that. We understand why we can get behind that. But there is a fundamentally embedded notion of privilege in the idea of decolonizing, right? Because you have to be privileged in order to, or have these privileged structures and exist in the sense to even start considering the idea of decolonizing. And so I'll give you a very brief example. I'm going to end very quickly of this notion outside of the animal welfare context, so we can step away from ourselves for a minute. In Guatemala, there's something called the Pan-Maya movement, and the movement fundamentally functions to make indigenous people visible. 60%, actually a little more than 60% of Guatemala is indigenous, and so they still remain highly invisible within Guatemalan culture. They're not able, essentially, to practice their religions. They practice their religions, but it's still considered substandard, right? Their language, even their form of dress is literally not legitimized in the nation state, right? And so I have this picture of a huipil, right? I'm sure you guys have seen these. People like to wear them. But one of the things the Pan-Maya movement tries to do is literally create spaces, or it's fighting for creating spaces where indigenous people can exist as they are, right? So they feel that if I'm going to go get a job in Guatemala, why can't I wear my traje, my traditional clothing, to go get a job? I have to change into Western wear so that you can accept me, and then I become legitimate enough for you to consider hiring. Why can't I speak in my native tongue, right, instead of having to speak Spanish? And so a lot of these things are not legitimized. However, I'm sure you've seen people walking around wearing huipils all the time, right? And they're like rocking the huipil and, oh yeah, I got this in Guatemala, whatever. And a lot of people of color will rock the huipils, right? Fundamentally embedded in that is the fact that you can wear this out in spaces and be considered legitimate because you have a certain sense of power that indigenous people themselves do not have, right? And so as people of color, we reproduce these oppressive discourse, even in our attempt to try to, put indigenous culture out there, right? And so it becomes an extremely, extremely complex situation. And so when we're shifting back to animal rights and veganism and all these things, when we're talking about decolonizing our diet, I've seen some posts about, we just need to go back and eat rice and beans because that's the food of our people, right? Depending on who you're talking about. That's what we do. But there are people who fundamentally have no other choice but to eat rice and beans, right? They're not the context is not one where let's choose to do this because we're decolonizing. They don't have a choice, but that's all that there is available, right? And then when they do consume meat or animal products are a product of privilege, right? And so it's related to status. And so many times you'll see poor communities in Latin America who subside off basic staples, who then have a party or some festival or something like that, and they'll consume animals for this period of time because it's related to this status as a status symbol, right? And while that is fundamentally rooted in colonialism and ideas of colonialism, to talk to somebody and tell them, well, you should decolonize your diet, right? It's like, well, maybe you should learn about our plight, right? And so this is what I mean by it gets very, very complex. And it's important that we check ourselves on a continuous basis, right? Because definitely people of color should strive not to reproduce this, but we all should definitely be moving towards thinking about these things as a community, thinking about the relationships between human and non-human domination, the marginalization of migrants, and other underrepresented groups specifically in this post-colonial context and in this context of neoliberalism and all this other stuff that exists. So I'm going to leave you guys with that. End of story. Thank you very much.